2 by 2. Everyone wanted to watch, but from a safe distance. The same they would watch someone dance with a lion or swallow fire. People were still shaking their heads and murmuring. She was really going through with it. The woman at the centre was small and careworn, a widow and mother of 8. She stood facing the 2 evangelists, her expression triumphant and concentrated. She was looking past all the incredulous faces, hearing past the muttered naysaying. As she raised her hands, the onlookers sucked in their breath. Conversion is defiance. We easily forget that in societies that don't think much about spirits. Among them were lighter, though everyone knew that turning to Jesus meant turning away from some other power, and nothing illustrated this more starkly than the ritual new believers performed to declare their faith. The spectators were always on edge, expecting something awful to befall the convert, who would raise his or her hand saying, "I receive Jesus as my Saviour," then sweeping them down behind the back in a dramatic arc, "And I renounce the devil and all his evil works." It was the second part that was truly dangerous. Spurn the devil, and you invite retaliation. The evangelists had preached in this village every day for 2 weeks, and powerfully, but only the widow had stepped forward. The angels may have been rejoicing, but here on earth the mood was less than festive. 2 weeks was a long investment in one place for such a small yield. The woman in front of them looked so diminutive apart from the others, so conspicuously alone. The preachers must have wondered how she'd survive in her new faith as the only believer in the village. Her neighbours, meanwhile, were waiting to see if she'd survive at all. The woman confessed her faith in Jesus. The evangelist congratulated her. The crowd waited in suspense. A few seconds passed without catastrophe. Finally, everyone dispersed to their homes and fields, casting an uneasy backward glances to see if she was still standing. Another village a couple of days away had urged the evangelists to come, promising that they were eager to hear the message about Jesus. It would be a welcome change from this rocky soil. The evangelist left town. 3 days later, the widow dropped dead. God's great works have small beginnings. Everything wild, dangerous, miraculous, and life-changing that happened in Wolaita that summer started with a tick of a box, and I was only the instigator. The Sodu Bible School was finishing its academic year, and our family was preparing to return to England for a long overdue furlough. We timed our departure for the day after the school closed, but there was one thing remaining. My students and I had spent a year poring over the Gospels, studying what I dubbed the Jesus training method, how the Lord had commissioned his disciples to proclaim the kingdom in every place where he wasn't known, to heal the sick and raise the dead. When I wrote the usual 10-question examination, designed as usual for the minimally literate, I added space for a voluntary yes or no response at the end. I couldn't leave Sodu without stirring up the nest. Remember what Jesus did in Luke 10, I asked my students from the front. He chose 72 others to go ahead of him, 2 by 2, to every valley and village where he was about to go, preaching the gospel and healing the sick. If you want to do the same during the rainy season this summer, then please tick the box at the bottom of your paper. I expected a handful of responses. These men were mostly on the older side. They all had family and church commitments, and besides, spending their summer vacation traipsing around the hills in the rain didn't sound all that attractive. A few bright-eyed ones might jump at the offer, and that would satisfy me. I was shocked when I tallied up the results. A full half the class, 55 students, had said yes, they'd taken the message to heart. There were about 750,000 Walaita believers in some 1,000 congregations at the time, presided over by a circle of elders that met for monthly table meetings. Many of these grizzled saints had suffered immensely for their faith in the early days of the church, and some had taken my Bible school class and understood my longing to partner with the indigenous church in reaching neighbouring peoples. Serendipitously, they were holding their council the very next day. When I dropped in on them, they welcomed me warmly and asked me to say my piece. "You know my family and I are leaving Sodo tomorrow," I said, "but look at this list. There are 55 men from the Bible school who are ready to obey Jesus by preaching the gospel all over Walaita this summer. I leave you to decide how best to use them, as God leads you. But please think of every part of Walaita where there's no Christian witness, every valley and every village." I passed them the list. The next day we embarked on the long trip back to England, and it was many weeks before a letter arrived, chronicling what the elders had done. The elders sought God. They prayed through the night, and in the morning they identified every neglected corner of Walaita. Now it was their turn to be surprised. There were more than 50 areas of their own ethnic territory without a Christian witness, and this among a fairly church people ethnic group. How could 55 men go 2 by 2 to 50 places? They would be spread thin and would have to move often to cover every village, and Jesus had said not to keep moving from house to house. Someone suggested doubling up the 55 and trying to reach only 27 places, a more modest goal. They could send future classes out to the remaining areas. After they turned to prayer again, though, one of the elders spoke up with a second proposal. "We have 55 men on this list, right? They can read, or they're supposed to be able to anyway. But we don't know if they have the gift of evangelism. But we all know hundreds of others outside the Bible school who will never learn to read but are proven evangelists. God's used them effectively in their ministries. So why don't we find 55 others and pair them up, one reader, one evangelist?" It was a creative solution, yet it uncovered what had been there all along, the God-given gifts in the church, outside formal education. The other elders immediately embraced the plan. The 110 gathered at Sodo to be commissioned. The elders gave each man a few birr to buy food during their itinerancy, and the churches told them that they'd try to raise the same amount for the fall tuition at the Bible school by the time the evangelists returned. With that they disappeared into the summer rain. Over the next few weeks, extraordinary reports reached the elders' ears, stories of mass conversions, of numerous physical healings and deliverances, of Satan's hold being broken over historically resistant corners of Walaita. There are even rumours of the dead being raised. July waned, August came, and the rain started to subside. The summer initiative had reached the end of its intended lifespan, but the participants were still in a frenzy of preaching and healing activity in far-flung valleys and villages. The fall term was looming, but many of the students were missing. The Bible school's administrators grew nervous, hoping the evangelists would remember the fall start date. Incredible accounts of God's work in Walaita continued to trickle back to Sodo. The old men were addicted to their task. The harvest field had ruined them for the classroom. How could they go back to a staid academic existence when God was thrilling them daily with miracles and salvations? Fall term arrived and half the students failed to show up. What was meant to be a short-term assignment had mushroomed into a full-time ministry, claiming a sizable chunk of the student body. The administrators fretted. They didn't want to quench the evangelistic spirit, but enrollment was really suffering. Messengers were sent out to summon the students back to school. The students didn't want to return. The experience had proven too exciting, Another month went by and still the Bible school was half empty. The elders decided it was time to introduce an incentive. They sent word that they were throwing a grand celebration where all the summer stories could be told and the results added up. They slaughtered 1 cow a day while the students gave their report, for as many days as the reporting took. Who could resist such an offer? Most Wolaita Christians only ate meat once a year, at Christmas, when the wealthier believers donated a cow to the community. News of the cows gave the students pause. They reconsidered their mandate in this fresh light. Yes, the gospel was still going forth, and the needs were great. There was a time and a season for everything. Maybe God was calling them back to Sodo after all. They couldn't dismiss the vision of the cows any more than Peter could wave away the sheet lowered from heaven. The words "kill and eat" dangled before them. They decided to return. The widow's village was in an uproar. Lament and hysteria mounted in equal measure. "We told her this would happen," neighbours wailed. "She renounces the spirits and this is what she gets." It was a local crisis. Who would care for her children? What would the witch doctor prescribe to restore harmony? Were the spirits appeased? Attention shifted to the evangelists, those disturbers of the peace who'd come in preaching foreign religion, misleading vulnerable women like the widow, bringing disaster on the community. Then conveniently leaving town just before the fallout. They were the undisputed culprits in this tragedy. The mourners quickly turned into a mob. "We should drag them back here and make them face the body," shouted one elder. "And then kill them," shouted another. The crowd roared its approval. The returners ate 3 cows in 3 days, while each pair of evangelists was accounted for and gave their testimony. I heard about the festivities from afar and longed to join them. When it was all over, the numbers showed that more than 10,000 Wolaita had given their lives to Christ that summer. A year later, I was back in Ethiopia. When I visited Sodo, the elders recounted the whole experience for me, and we praised God together for all that he had accomplished in Wolaita through a simple step of obedience. I heard many incredible tales that week, but none as remarkable as the one I heard through Selma. Selma was an aging missionary who devoted most of her life to the Wolaita, making Sodo her home and working tirelessly for the spread of the kingdom. She is already well into her 60s by the time I met her. Hearing that I was back in town, she invited me to her house for coffee. "There's someone I want you to meet," she said. The other guest was a wiry old evangelist, the unlettered partner in one of the pairs sent out the previous summer. He spoke no English and only a smattering of Amharic, and my Wolatinya couldn't keep pace with his narration. So Selma translated the story. "I've heard some wild things in my time," she said by way of a preface, "but this one is true. This actually happened." The man proceeded to tell us about the great failure of his ministry, about a woman who'd given her life to Jesus and then died. "That's it, God. You can find somebody else. After all the preaching I do for you, the risks I take, the things I put up with, I'm done. I'm done being an evangelist." He hadn't meant to say these things out loud, but he was past the point of control. Laughter broke out around him, harsh and humorless. "Don't worry," said one of the men. "You won't be an evangelist after this. You won't be anything. You said your Jesus could raise people from the dead, right? Good, because if he doesn't, this is it for you." They'd never managed to find the younger evangelist, only the old man, so they'd taken him back alone. He'd been revelling in the openness of his hosts in the second village, marvelling at how easy it was to preach the gospel here. When the mob confronted him, they were livid. Everything from then on had unfolded like a nightmare, the details sudden, irrational, disjointed. The road back to the widow's village had given him ample time for reflection. These men wanted blood and justice, and why not? His God had failed, or at least made him fail. The woman had publicly put her trust in Jesus, then died 3 days later, without warning, leaving a bunch of orphans. If the spirits hadn't killed her out of revenge, it certainly looked that way. God wasn't taking any pains to clarify things. It was bad by all accounts. Someone should pay for this. He was too angry to be truly afraid. He had hours to complain, hours to turn this moment over in his mind and try to come to terms with the crushing disappointment. The loss of faith, the shame, all wrapped around the event itself. But his bitterness was like miles of tangled string. The more he pulled, the more there seemed to be. They rounded a bend and the village came into sight. She'd been dead 3 days by now. The house where the body lay had been transformed for the funeral. Beer brewed for the guests mellowed in large pots. Cowhide shrouds were spread out for the impending burial, and women wailed in the dim lights. The mob arrived, prisoner in tow, and the wailing rose to a hysterical pitch as the mourners caught sight of him. The body was laid out near the far wall. The men on either side steered him roughly toward it, through a sea of lament and indignation, through the center of the howling cries. He couldn't bear it. The voices threatened to crash over him. These must be her children, so many of them around the corpse, eyes dull and red, 8 orphans. His anger flared. God, why don't you do something? The woman sat up. The wailing modulated and broke. People yelped and screamed, stampeding for the door. Everyone fought to exit first, while the evangelist stood alone before the woman, dumbfounded. She was just as perplexed. She squinted at him and turned her head slowly, groggily, trying to make sense of the bedlam. When her eyes settled on the cowhides and pots of beer, she frowned. Who's died? God delights to take responsibility for the consequences of our following him. He is fully trustworthy, but we don't discover that until we follow him fully. I was as surprised as anyone. I really didn't think God would do that, the evangelist told us with a laugh and a head shake. Indeed, he practically lost his faith along the way. The sermon he preached to the cautiously returning crowd was, I'm sure, the most self-effacing he'd ever given. He confessed that the miracle hadn't been his plan all along. Only God had known the outcome from the start. All glory belonged to Jesus, who rose from the dead and still has power over death today. Like the students and evangelists who went out 2 by 2 to cover a light with the gospel, we can never predict exactly what Jesus is going to do or where he will take us when we follow him. It may lead to crisis. All we know is that he goes ahead of us, preparing the way. The crisis isn't the last word, but again we don't discover that unless we obey. When all the stories have been told, the elders at Sodu said the words I've been longing to hear. Malcolm, we can now confidently say that the gospel has been preached in every part of Wolaita. We know what's been in your heart. We're ready to go with you to the other people groups in the lowlands, the ones who've never heard of Jesus.